You gotta hand it to engineers. What would we do without them? They invent, build, and fix things to make all our lives easier. But you really must respect a guy who helped light the way for ships while being totally blind himself. Here's the incredible story of Alexander Mitchell. Born in 1780 in Dublin, Mitchell grew up in a wealthy family. While he was still a boy, the family moved to Belfast. Bright young Alexander entered the prestigious Belfast Academy, where he excelled in science and math. Unfortunately, as they say, there's no fortune big enough to make a wealthy person a healthy one. And at a mind-boggling fast rate, Mitchell's eyesight started to get worse and worse. By the time he was 16, he couldn't read at all. Just 6 years later, at the age of 22, Alexander Mitchell was completely blind. Did that put him down? Absolutely not. He just kept on living an ordinary life, got married, and had 5 kids. Apart from math and science, he loved music and is said to have had a beautiful singing voice. He could also play the flute and accordion. Just goes to show you that truly talented people are usually gifted in many fields. Mitchell really enjoyed his social life, and while entertaining his guests, he acted so natural that some people didn't even notice that he was totally blind. He played cards and backgammon with everyone else, although he did have a special person to help him distinguish the names of the cards or a dice throw. All his free time spent entertaining his friends and family wasn't too far from science though. Many famous names of the time, like fellow Irishman and astronomer Thomas Robinson and English mathematician George Boole, were usually among the guest list. Anyway, early on in his adult life, Mitchell set up a successful brickmaking business and started building houses around Belfast. But it was around this time when his inner inventor awoke. In order to make everything run more smoothly and efficiently in his business, the blind man created some specific machines necessary for brick manufacturing and construction. When he turned 51, the successful entrepreneur and inventor decided it was time for a much-needed break. However, his inquisitive mind wouldn't let him retire so easily. Living most of his life in Belfast, a city historically and geographically closely connected to the sea and shipping, Mitchell had heard plenty of stories about ships being grounded by underwater sandbanks. To understand what a major problem that was back then, imagine yourself on a 19th century ship approaching the harbor. The vessel is expensive, full of goods, and more importantly, carrying lots of people. You don't have any GPS or some other satellite or radar system to show you what lies beneath the surface of the water or what the seabed looks like. Not to mention, the terrain under the water is soft and can change with the currents, meaning a place you sailed perfectly before could now be a lot shallower than it once was. You're almost to the harbor when you suddenly hear a terrifying thud. You and everyone else on board are thrown forward as the ship comes to an unexpected halt. The vessel has scraped the seabed and is probably damaged. There could be a hole in the hull, and you, along with all the other crew members and the precious cargo you're carrying, could find yourself sinking any minute now. During Alexander Mitchell's time, these sorts of things could and did happen. Everybody knew that sandy coasts were dangerous for shipping for that exact reason. The shape of the seabed could change so easily and drastically, meaning it was very possible for even an experienced sailor to come across a literal sand mountain underwater while being 100% sure that there was a perfect seabed open for safe passage. These kinds of banks can usually be found at the mouth of a river or at a port. Both were true for Belfast. Even though Mitchell wasn't a sailor, he was a capable builder with a mind set on fixing problems, and the threat of these sandbanks was really disturbing for the Irishman. Now, normally you'd think, hey, isn't this exactly what lighthouses are for? And you'd be right. Lighthouses are like traffic lights for ships that serve as a guide and warning of dangerous areas. But how can you build a lighthouse on a soft, sandy seabed that's constantly shifting? That doesn't make for a very stable foundation. And that's where Alexander Mitchell's great inventive mind got to work. Having retired from the brickmaking business, the blind man found himself a new challenge to tackle. Since it was impossible to do anything about the surface of the sea bottom or the sandbank, and a lighthouse built on the shore wouldn't do any good in this situation. Mitchell thought of an ingenious way to anchor the construction into the soft, malleable seabed. It took him a year to come up with the perfect solution, but in 1833, he patented the screw-pile lighthouse. This is what would bring the Irishman international fame and have his name among the greatest engineers of all time to this day. So, how did his brainchild work? His solution is surprisingly simple. Instead of installing post-like iron piles straight into the soft mud or sand to make a foundation, a method that works fine when you're building a foundation on hard, unchangeable terrain, he came up with the idea of screwing them in place, sort of like a corkscrew. Thus, he suggested slightly remodeling each pile so that they'd have propeller-like blades at one end that could be twisted into place. This way of anchoring a lighthouse was not only relatively inexpensive, but also foolproof, since the piles could be screwed at a depth of about 21 feet. It was an outstanding invention for a guy that had no special training in either engineering or lighthouse construction, and no eyesight, mind you. Being a responsible builder, Alexander needed to make sure that everything would work properly. So as soon as his giant corkscrew was created, Mitchell secretly rowed out to one of the sandbanks in the Belfast harbor with his 19-year-old son John. The two men installed a screw pile, and early the next morning, they went back to find it still firmly fixed in place. They did the same trial the next day and then in a few more spots, and his screw pile held up every time. But it'd take him 5 more years of waiting until his invention would be used in construction for the first time. Trinity House, which built lighthouses in Britain and Ireland back then, was the first to give Mitchell's screw pile a go. It was used for the Maitland Sands Lighthouse at the mouth of the Thames in 1838. Although he was a capable engineer, the inventor was still really worried about everything working perfectly. So the now 58-year-old man personally went to the construction site and climbed up the unfinished building. It was obviously not a good idea to put his personal well-being at stake. But I imagine he was thinking that if he didn't triple-check for himself that this thing was solid, he'd be putting the lives of numerous sailors and seafarers at risk in the future. Whatever his thought process was, the blind man did periodically fall into the water and then climbed right back up again to check whether the builders were doing everything right. He'd further personally supervise a few more constructions like this. Such a remarkable attitude shows how passionate and caring he was for his creation, which happened to be destined to stay useful for years to come. The success of his invention allowed Alexander to return to the construction business again and significantly expand its borders. By the beginning of the 20th century, hundreds of screw-pile lighthouses went up not only all over the British Isles, but also in North America. Among them there are, for example, cottage-type screw-pile lighthouses of the Carolina Sounds, Chesapeake Bay, Delaware Bay, along the Gulf of Mexico, and along the Florida coast. Not to mention, countless bridges and piers have been built around the world using the screw pile method as well. The installation of Mitchell's screw piles was not only economically beneficial, but also eco-friendly. Screwing the foundations into the seabed means you don't need to take out a bunch of excess soil and transport it somewhere else. That cuts transportation costs and reduces the environmental impact each project has. Apparently, this is the reason why this method is still widely used for a variety of constructions, be it lighthouses, railways and roads, or even telecommunications. Wow! Do you know about any other great inventors with fascinating backstories? Feel free to share your thoughts down in the comments. If you learned something new today, then give this video a like and share it with a friend. But hey, don't go firing up your lighthouses just yet. We have over 2,000 cool videos for you to check out. All you have to do is pick the left or right video, click on it, and enjoy. Stay on the bright side of life.